WWE A&E Biography series is back, and I'm playing catch up here on the first one, which was about Randy Orton. And I thought this was really well done. I've always enjoyed these, not every one of them. There are certain ones that I haven't exactly loved. I think the Randy Savage one was probably at the top of that list, but that's a discussion that doesn't apply to this one. But yeah, I think for the most part, these have been pretty well done. And obviously, these are more aimed at people who don't know every little detail about a certain professional wrestler, and so you get the full story in most of these, and it's kind of sort of the basic foundation of what this superstar has gone through, kind of to get to this point in their career, and all of that. But I thought they really, did a great job of not just sort of painting this as some pretty picture for Randy Orton, because if you know Randy Orton's story, you know that it's been anything but that for a very long time. And I thought, kind of just the way they went about this, a really good job of kind of bringing out how when Randy Orton, first got his start, it's sort of the thing we've always heard about him, right? He was someone who just picked it up at very early, and he was someone who just came along so quickly. And ultimately, that led to him being the youngest world champion in WWE history. And there was a reason for that, because he was able to pick things up. He just had that natural, I think that it kept being referred to as sort of effortless. Like everything he does, it just seems effortless, because Orton just kind of, again, is sort of gravitated to that, whether it is just from being, the son of Bob Orton, or being, Bob Orton Sr. Like they kind of went into the family dynamics of all that with his father, his grandfather, and everything, and just sort of, kind of pointing out it's not, very often, I think it was Shawn Michaels who said it, where you have a guy who is, this person who comes from a family of people who have been in professional wrestling, and they just pick it up to the point to where they just sort of, immediately kind of step out of that shadow. And it's not just talking about, the family name. It's just this guy has become a legend in his own right? He's not trying to chase someone else. And that's kind of what the story of Randy Orton was. When, he started in OVW, they kind of went into all that. About sort of, pointing out that, hey, at first, and I think the footage here is what, if you really need to watch this, because as always, it's like WWE has so many gazillion hours of footage with every little kind of situation that you could think of. And you go back and kind of see some of this stuff from OVW. Of course, Jim Cornette was running things there, and they sort of brought back the point that, hey, once Randy Orton gets to OVW and he really starts to pick things up, and he's really rubbing people the wrong way. You meant John Cena, Batista, all these guys are kind of commenting and talking about, Randy Orton was essentially just an asshole, and he's there to make money. And they even caught him on one of these pieces of footage that you see saying, and I think Cornette had said it previously in that era, was that Orton was just there to make money or something like that. And you have Orton kind of saying it on camera. They catch him, in whatever situation, and he's saying the same thing, like, hey, I'm just here to make money. Whether jokingly or not, it's just that was kind of the personality of Randy Orton at the time. And I thought they did a great job kind of bringing up how he got there, right? This wasn't the guy who was the apex predator in high school. Like he says, he was someone who got bullied. He was someone who enjoyed sports, but really, his father was never there, right? Because Bob Orton's on the road with just a ridiculous WWF schedule at that time. And so, that's kind of his outlet, is he gets into doing different sports, and he mentions how amateur wrestling is something that he really gravitated to. And then, he kind of goes into the story, which I thought this was fascinating. And again, people may know this, but I think it's interesting to hear Randy Orton talk about this many years removed, right? Like, because and that's kind of the story here, is that as Randy Orton gets older, he's getting more of that kind of understanding of everything, right? He's not where he was 20 years ago, when he becomes the youngest world heavyweight champion, and he's still just a kid. It's getting that perspective of what things were like at that time. And he recalled the story, which, if you haven't kind of heard the background of the story, where he goes, he gets recruited by the Army recruiter, and as Orton's telling him, he's like, look, this is a guy who's basically just there, kind of selling you on the dream of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? I mean, it's that kind of mantra to where, you're going to have everything and all this. And so, he goes to boot camp, and as he said, it sort of turned him into a man. But then he realizes that he sees the hazing stuff going on and all of this stuff, and he really go into detail about some of these stories that he witnessed kind of in this hazing stuff that happened, when he gets into the military. And yeah, and then he's like, hey, I don't want to be here. And, that's kind of one of those roads where you can't just say that, right? I mean, you've got to, there's obviously things, and he went into, he's like, look, they tell you, no, you're here. And, he winds up going home. Ultimately, I think it was 38 days. He winds up going there in terms of, sort of going but behind bars essentially. And he talks about just how rough it was. And he winds up working at a gas station for $5 an hour. And he's like, what the hell am I going to do with my life? And then that's where, if you want the trivia note, the person who essentially is, I guess, responsible for the start of Randy Orton's career is Bruce Pritchard, because that's when Bob Orton decides to call Bruce Pritchard, and Orton winds up going, Randy Orton that is, winds up going to a house show in October of 1999 in St. Louis. And he says, he sees the interaction, and it's kind of interesting to think of it like full circle, right? He sees Edge, Adam Copeland, walk up to his father and tell him how huge of a fan he is. And Randy Orton's just like, wow, like that's sort of one of those things that just sort of hits you at the time. And you're like, okay, this is Edge, somebody he's watched. And Orton talked about how he just started watching wrestling again and all that kind of when he's down in the dumps a little bit. And so he's watching wrestling, Edge is someone kind of, gravitate to a little bit. And he talks about just how kind of cool that was to see Edge telling his father how much of a fan he was of him. And then Edge kind of giving the line that, he'd hope to be in the ring one day with Randy. And so that kind of sends Randy off, very motivated at that point, wants to be able to kind of prove himself again, to get into the spotlight. And I think it was, Bruce Pritchard had told him they start paying him basically $250 per week. And that's when he gets to the OVW part. And we talked about that sort of, the other wrestlers essentially just thinking Randy Orton was a dick. They just thought that his, again, personality, his approach was not mature. And that was the theme too of this biography, is that you kind of just get a lot of that stuff where Randy Orton is like, hey, I am going to tell you right now, and I am not afraid to admit it. Like, I was immature. I did not have what I needed to be able to handle all of that fame and being the guy who, again, becomes the youngest world heavyweight champion. Think about that. And all the pressure that comes along with that, being the face of the company and all this other stuff. And you kind of get the background of that, like in OVW, how much different he was then. And he talks about kind of at the time, even though he's having, this personality that just does not click with everyone else. And though he's still trying to do everything he can to become the biggest star that he can. He talks about how he picked up, or we went to WWE, wanted them to send tapes. I think specifically he mentioned Ricky Steamboat, Arn Anderson, Pat Patterson, people like that, and how he's just studying it to kind of pick up the skills even more, even faster, right? He wants to be able to pick up all these different skills. And he said it, that sort of, once he starts picking everything up, he becomes more confident, but he also becomes more arrogant. And that's where I thought this was kind of where the things, sort of shine a little bit, because you get these interactions like he would have with fans once he gets to the main roster, all this other stuff. And obviously this comes after the injury, because if you remember, Orton comes up to the main roster, he gets the injury, pretty quickly into that. He made his debut, I think, April 25th, 2002. They kind of showed the footage of his match with Hardcore Holly on SmackDown. But then he wrestles Christian. He tears his labrum, dislocates his arm, all this other stuff, just on a dropkick, on a routine dropkick. And so kind of kept pushing through. But then, of course, they keep him around doing all the injury updates, the RNN stuff. I thought those were great at the time. And when you look back at them now, like, it was perfect. And they play into that here, how great that was to bring out the personality of Randy Orton and start to mold this type of character where he's not just, this young-looking babyface anymore, right? He becomes this sort of just swarmy heel, and, he's just someone that you love to boo, and the fans were booing it, right? Whenever he comes out and gives the injury updates and all of that. And I think it was Brian Gewirtz that kind of said, this was perfect because, Randy's kind of one of the biggest assholes there is, of course, talking about him kind of in that era, and it was great for him to kind of just play up this tremendous sort of cocky heel role. It was perfect, again, for everything that kind of Randy Orton was at the time. And then, of course, you evolve, pun intended, into the Evolution days, where they went into that a bit and talking about sort of Triple H and Ric Flair having their eye on Randy Orton. And, him joining that faction with Batista ultimately and just the foursome that created, it was just unbelievable. And Orton, again, talks about sort of studying things and thinking about you're riding on road trips, learning from Triple H and Ric Flair, like two of the best to ever do it, and how much he picked up during that. But, again, this is kind of where things start to turn a little bit, where Orton's situation is that, he gets into this character, right? He gets into the legend killer gimmick, all of this other stuff. And like we said, he starts to become someone who is getting a higher profile in WWE. He's becoming more important in terms of them pushing him as a top star. Has the match with Mick Foley that sort of made him, I guess you could say, in 2004. That was at Backlash. And how that kind of proved that, okay, this is not just a young kid from OVW who just got here and picked everything up anymore. This is a guy that has become one of the top stars in the company, and he's kind of getting over now after everything he did in that wild match against Mick Foley with the thumbtacks and everything like that. And Orton said it, he went from being a kid to something more at this time, but that's where things started to spiral a little bit, because he does become the youngest world champion at SummerSlam 2004. And, he kind of recalls just the emotions around that, but also everything that came along with it, as we've said, and just not having the maturity to be able to handle it. Whether it's, again, the pressures of being out in front of everyone, fans, having to interact with fans. And there was so much footage here of Orton just kind of interacting and just being an absolute prick to fans. And you get some of that kind of added into the mix here. And, of course, the partying, all this other stuff. But there was Cody Rhodes, Santino Marella, everyone, like, just kind of recalling him just doing things that were just completely off the wall. I think it was Santino. I'm looking at it here now. Yeah, talking about how there was he put dynamite in a hotel lobby. Cody talking about him breaking a urinal right in front of him. Like, all these different things, and you can see this inside of Randy Orton just building and building and building it. And they're telling the story. Look, why is this happening? Because, again, this was clearly someone who early on just did not know his path. And as he gets into this, there's that frustration, there's that anger, all these other things that are still built up with Randy Orton at the time. And so Rey Mysterio, I thought Rey Mysterio had a great line here, and Triple H had a great one too. Rey's like, look, the thing I was worried about most during that time period for Randy Orton was him interacting with fans. And it's like, wow, right? You think about that now. It's like, okay, you put someone out there with the fans, like, okay, you don't even have to think about it. Like, okay, this is the person we're putting out there to represent our company, and we don't have to think anything about it, right? Interacting with fans. But Orton at the time was just, again, it was like a ticking time bomb. And, that was kind of what Rey Mysterio had to say. And then there, Triple H is sort of like, hey, this guy could be one of the greatest to ever do it. And he's like, you could have everything, but you are hell-bent on making sure that for whatever reason, here's the line, actually, I just found it in my notes. Here's the quote from Triple H. I thought this was fantastic and really sums up everything. You have every gift imaginable to be the biggest star this business has ever seen, and the only one that can stop you is you. And you are hell-bent on doing it, and I don't know why. Like that, I thought perfectly sort of encapsulated everything about kind of the story of Randy Orton at this time, because this was something where, again, it's just starting to, it's a little bit more each time, right? And then he goes into, the addiction to painkillers. And this was a really, kind of tough watch, because if you don't know the full story here, it is like he's talking about how many of these things he's taking and how it sort of got worse. I think he said around WrestleMania 21, where he had this match against The Undertaker, completely misses the rehearsal for the match because again, he's just sort of all this stuff, and he slept through it, completely misses the biggest match of his career to that point with The Undertaker at WrestleMania. Think about the mystique that holds. He missed the rehearsal, and Taker's like, hey, I didn't want to bother him. I was pissed. I was disrespected, but I didn't want to bother him because, hey, he's about to wrestle The Undertaker. And so I don't want to get him thrown off any more, than already am. But I was pissed off. That's basically what The Undertaker says. And then you kind of have, as always, you have that breaking point, right? And I thought, you could see sort of the emotions here where Randy's like, there were a couple of breaking points. It was giving the Hall of Fame speech for his dad, Bob Orton. And he's like, I went up there. I didn't have anything prepared, nothing. And I went about 30 seconds, and that's all I had for my father, who's getting inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And then they showed the footage of once, Bob Orton comes up to accept, everything, and he starts to go into his speech, Orton's just sitting to the side in this chair, slumped down, completely out of it, and you've got the cameraman saying, "Hey, Randy, can you please sit up?" Like all these kind of things. Again, this is a guy who just became a world champion, all this other stuff, and he's having to be told by a cameraman to sit up because he's out of it on the stage at the Hall of Fame because he had been partying and all this other stuff, the previous night. And so you can see the pattern here. And that's when Orton says, look, that was my biggest regret, is the fact that I did not do more for my father's biggest night, basically, in the history of his career, being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, and that's what I gave him. That's all I could give him. And he talked about how he did not learn. He thought he was untouchable, and that's kind of when he realized was not the case. And then they kind of go to 2006, where, again, he's talking about just dealing with all the pain and the injuries and everything that comes along with it, addicted to painkillers. But still, like, he's at this point where he's taking them because he just thought he needs them. And even when he's not injured, he's still taking them because he needs them, right? That's kind of the thought there. And, again, you have all the different people weighing in here. And you think about the cast of characters that Randy Orton's surrounded by at this time. You've got Triple H, we said. You've got the entire Evolution group, but you've also got John Cena. Cena talking about how important and good he was, and basically Cena trying to lead him down the right path. But still, he's doing all this stuff, right? The Kofi Kingston thing, the infamous, stupid in the match, just going off the hinge kind of at any moment. And then, having the promo exchange he had with The Rock, and Brian Gewirtz is telling kind of the story of how Randy Orton just got pissed because he thought The Rock went too far and all this other stuff, like in their promo exchange. And then Orton's like, hey, it got to the point there where I know that I was a couple away from just overdosing. He's like, I knew it, like at that time. I knew that I was just a couple away. And, and then it happens. He has the accidental overdose, winds up in the emergency room. He didn't tell WWE, but Vince calls him in, and he gets suspended for 60 days. And, he's like, the way I reacted to that, I mean, you have to watch Orton tell the story here, but like it is incredible to think about this visual. Orton's like, the way I reacted was, I am punching myself, I am banging my head against the wall, and again, he's doing this inside the office here. And Vince is like, hey, I'm not letting you leave the room like this. And again, Orton said flat out, the reason he was acting out, the reason all this was going on, he did not know what it meant to sort of be a man yet. And again, can you trace all that back to just having a dad who's on the road 300 plus days a year? And Bob Orton, I think the numbers always get you in these kind of scenarios. Bob Orton, I think back is like, he said at one point in this, he's like, I probably saw Randy 10 or 12 days a year. 365 days a year. He saw his son probably 10 or 12 days a year because of the WWF schedule at that time and how much you're on the road, there in the 80s, 90s, right? Like, I mean, just incredible when you think about just kind of the schedule and what that did and everything. And so Orton winds up going to this, like I said, he goes into this thing. He gets like a 96-hour assessment, he said. And they give him all these different things like psychological stuff. He's like anger management, narcissism, problems with authority, all these other things. Like they're like, you fit all these. And again, they kind of do the parallels with Shawn Michaels. And because look, Shawn was at that point at one point in his career too. Like we all remember that. And so kind of drawing it there and how Orton's saying, hey, we butted heads when we first met with Shawn Michaels. Because, again, there's just kind of that there's a lot there, that very similar paths for these two at one point. But then that's when, Orton's like, hey, the person that was there for me, and two people in particular, it wasn't just these two, but there were two people that I think had a huge impact, and you got to tell it with the way he talked about him here. Edge was the person, he said, was just kind of always there for him. Like Orton said, I could have wound up in the hotel lobby completely out of my mind, but Edge always made sure, I wasn't out there. I got back to my room, all these other things. He took care of me. And then he recalls the story where Santino, he's riding with Santino, they're going along, like driving along the ocean or something like that, and how Santino just said, he sees Orton with the painkillers, and he's like, no. He's like, throw him out. Like, get him out of here. And so Orton just like, I remember just, vividly just throwing these painkillers out the window. And Santino's like, I don't want you to become the next person in the line of people that this has happened to. And he mentioned several names with that. And so when does everything change for Randy Orton, right? It's when he has his daughter from his first marriage. And I think this is the side of Randy Orton, right? If you're used to seeing the legend killer, the apex predator, the viper, all this other stuff, you just see this in-ring persona. This is where these kind of biographies, these kind of documentaries, they humanize someone, because this is where you see just the love that this guy has for his family, and how having his daughter born in the summer of 2008, how that sort of changed his perspective on everything. It gave him a different motivation. And again, he kind of said, look, I decided to use this frustration, use this anger, not just lashing out, outside the ring and all this other stuff. Like, it changed when my daughter was born. It just became part of my in-ring character. And that's, again, how he became this sort of legendary figure now, to where he's built this character that is based around some of the own personality issues that he had, right? Some of the things that bothered him throughout his life. It's all within his character now. It's not just stuff that, just boils over outside the ring. He used it for his character. And so they kind of go into, meeting his wife, Kim, at a house show in Poughkeepsie. And that was kind of, again, interesting. You talk about WWE having all this footage, being able to see this footage of this house show where Randy Orton is like basically staring at her and going over and shaking her hand and meeting her and all this. It's just wild to think, like, they've got all this footage of stuff, even going back that far. Like, they can pinpoint when Randy Orton met his wife. That's the kind of footage that they have. But hey, it's WWE. There are cameras everywhere. And so, again, the whole family aspect of this is really what you see here, and what kind of pushes Orton into a different part of his life, a different part of his career, and how it all just kind of ties together. And, Bob Orton's like, hey, Randy's a man now. Like, he's not that young kid anymore. And Orton kind of, you can see sort of the veteran part of this. Now, there is one part, I think, of this, you have to understand too, like, this, who knows exactly when this was recorded, but a good chunk of this towards the end is kind of about how the team with Riddle, which feels like forever ago now, but how that sort of gave Randy Orton another kind of lease on his career, because you think about it, he's like, hey, I'm having all these back issues and all this other stuff. I can't work singles matches. So he talks about kind of how the tag team with Riddle sort of reinvigorated his career. And of course, they go into the stories about how Orton didn't like him when they first met, because Orton, felt like Riddle gave him the snub and all this other stuff. But, and he's just kind of talking about the back issues. They have the interviews with the doctors and kind of just showing, Randy's back being screwed up and all this other stuff. There's just, I think this was, again, I thought this was one of the better ones they've done, because it really, you're not holding anything back here. If you're going to tell the story of Randy Orton, you've got to tell the good and the bad. And there was a lot of bad for a while in Randy Orton's career. I mean, he was someone, as he said, he got that fame way too early. He could not handle it. And you saw the potential downfall. And I mean, he mentioned it. He's like, look, there had to be times where I was just a couple away from that being it, right? And you think about it, I mean, now it's just like, what a different person. And it's just that learning experience, that growth as a man, as he said, and really just how family, his daughter, all of this has kind of pushed him to be a different person. And how now, he's looking back at all the guys that gave back to him when he was in his career early on, right? Whether it's Triple H, Ric Flair, all these other guys, everyone that's helping him out. And how he wants to be that guy now. Like, he is the locker room leader, right? Like, that's Randy Orton. He's not the Randy Orton who was just, the guy who knows what's going to happen with this guy 20 years ago. But now, like, he has morphed himself into the locker room leader. And, you've got, again, Foley saying, hey, this guy deserves to be in the discussion for the greatest of all time. Hogan's talking about how he's just the ultimate wrestler. Shawn Michaels, again, kind of talking about how hard it is to step out of that shadow as a second-generation star and just become what he became so early in his career. Like, knowing that this guy's going to be a Hall of Famer a couple years into his career, basically, unless he stops himself. And there was a point where he was stopping himself. But then he's able to turn it around and, kind of have that redemption for Randy Orton. And so Orton kind of finishes up the biography, I think, talking about how, what does he want most out of this? He just wants his peers to remember him as, hey, someone who was a good hand, considered him one of the best to do it. And I think the visual towards the end of this documentary, where it's like Orton saying, I am finally at a point now where I can step back and sort of smell the roses. I can finally enjoy this, right? And you think about the pressures that come along with being a WWE superstar, all that pressure that's on him at a young age. there was never a possibility. You're in it, like you're in the middle of it, right? There's no chance to sort of see what, I mean, again, that's what he's talking about. It's just the potential to spiral out of control is always there. But now that he's this point in his career, he can finally step back and just enjoy what he's accomplished, both inside and outside of the ring, whether it's, all the accolades in the ring, the championships, the great matches, all this outside the ring, the family, the children. Like, he can finally step back and appreciate all these things. And I think for someone like this, it's hard to even measure that level of appreciation because of everything he went through to get to this point and all the bumps along the way, right? All the different things that they went into in pretty good detail in this documentary about how he overcame this, he overcame that, the substance abuse, just the personality stuff that was getting him into trouble, all these different things. It's a new Randy Orton. And I think that is something where he could have been a cautionary tale. Randy Orton could have absolutely been one of those people that we look back on and say, wow, what that guy could have been. But he was able to turn it around. And as it was said in this, he will go down as one of the best of his generation. He will absolutely be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And I think when you watch this, and I've always thought this really, more recently now, I don't know that people will fully appreciate just how good Randy Orton is and is what he does. Like, I think, again, it's the effortless skill. It's all the things, everything he does in the ring, there's a purpose for it. He's not just doing stuff to do stuff. It's that old school mentality. And again, you think about all the people he learned from, right, early in his career. Those things have just kind of stayed with him throughout, his wrestling career. And I think you just see what I think he will be someone that hopefully people fully appreciate. There are going to be people out there that say, oh, well, his matches were just too slow or boring or methodical. But, I just don't think that's the case. I think this is someone who, again, he got it so quickly. He got it. And he understood kind of the basic foundation of professional wrestling and what you have to do, make everything matter. Not just doing stuff to do it, doing it because it's cool. Do it because it means something. There's something to the story that you're trying to tell in the ring. And that's where Randy Orton, it's just, that's the character, right? That's the guy who he's the Viper. He's always kind of just slithering around, ready to strike at any time. And he's become one of the best to ever do it because of that. So I would highly recommend this. I know I went into all this detail, but in all honesty, it's just because of how much I enjoyed this one. Again, I've enjoyed these for the most part over the past couple of years. There's a couple I did not. Like I said, the Randy Savage one I thought was just not good, but this one I thought was tremendous. So I would highly recommend, if you're a Randy Orton fan, if you're not a Randy Orton fan, check it out because it definitely tells his full story and everything he's been through, and I think you will have a much greater appreciation for the story of Randy Orton coming out of this one. So let me know what you guys think. If you watched it, the Randy Orton A&E Biography, more to come. Sergeant Slaughter up next. We'll also look at some of the WWE Rivals series. We'll start to kind of do some reviews on those as well. So we'll get around to the Triple H and Rock one soon enough. We'll have that coming here at Wrestling Reaction. Let me know what you guys think of Randy Orton A&E Biography. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button. Just a new channel here. Enjoy talking wrestling. So love your feedback as always. But appreciate you watching here at Wrestling Reaction. We'll talk to you again here soon.